Yes, I've got a presentation here today to talk about my how you can garden for birds. It's more a perspective of why it's so important to garden for birds. Now, can everybody hear me?
Yes. They will be. Yeah, they will. They'll let us know if they can't.
Sit down.
Yeah.
I see, right. Fantastic. I'm Maree McCarthy. I do have my own business, Nature's Magic Garden Designs. I'm a consultant and I run workshops on creating backyard habitat and that sort of thing. I'm an ecologist. I've done a degree in environmental scientist and I'm a horticulturist, and I have a passionate interest in native plants. I'm secretary for the Newcastle group of Australian Plant Society. So I'll go through what I think is some interesting game-changing information that I have found out in the last year. And while I'm not an expert on birds, I think we need to do some more research into this area, and I would love the word to get around and for Australia to have a look at this information that I have found. So first, the bad news. Australia has a bad reputation for loss of biodiversity, of course. 22 Australian birds already been lost, and so much has been bulldozed legally as well as illegally, and the laws haven't got very much better recently. However, next. One there. And also the situation is not much better overseas. I saw an article that said North America has lost 3 billion birds in the last 50 years. And I remember a lot of different birds that we had when I was young, but we don't have now. So it is a similar situation overseas. So that things are getting quite dire. I don't like to be too negative, but we do need to address the problem, which is becoming out of control. It's quite bad. Then I came across a book called Bringing Nature Home, written by a guy called Doug Tallamy, a professor at a university in the States. And he suggests over there that we convert lawn to gardens, or at least half of it. He said, even if we converted half of all the lawn area that we dedicate to our suburbs, it would amount to 200,000 square kilometres. And if we did that into native habitat, it's worth a lot more than what we actually preserve in national parks over there, as well as in Australia. I couldn't get the figures of what we have on lawn here. I found a lot of differing and conflicting figures, sometimes sponsored by the turf industry. And it's really hard to sort of, find out that exact information. But I mean, Blindfried, you can see there's a lot of lawn around, a lot of area gets mowed. So Doug Tallamy has some great talks and websites on the internet. I highly recommend having a listen to some of his talks. But yeah, he talks about the initial goal of 20 million acres of native plantings, which represents half of the green lawns privately owned properties. And I think we could do a similar thing here. I'd love to see a website like he has set up called Grow Your Own National Park. And they have liaised with landscape and companies, and they've collected a list of plants that are really suitable for home gardens, which are really good for supporting birds. Doug is an entomologist by trade and also a keen birdo. So how much potential bird habitat do we give to lawn? This is an intriguing question. Or fake turf. I've noticed with dismay how popular that has become lately. I don't think I need to go into all the problems associated with that. This is a photo of mine, which I was very proud of, because I planted this Banksia tree in my garden specifically because I knew that the black cockatoos love the Banksia seeds. It took quite a while. It was about 10 years before it was big enough to feed the family. There was about 7 of them in this tree, and they only stayed for about half an hour, cleaned up all the seeds, and they were gone. So it does take a while for the trees to grow, but it's definitely worth it. But the point I wanted to make was native gardens are important in America, apparently. They're really getting on board with that. But in Australia, I think it's even more important, and I'll explain why. One reason is that, well, Australia is very unique. I mean, there's already a time lag before we see the effects of environmental destruction. For example, the birds in Australia live on average 4 times longer than the birds overseas on average. I think that's quite remarkable. We've had Gisela Kaplan talk for a bird club before, and she talks about the longevity of birds too. She's got some wonderful books. Does anyone? Yes. Yeah, she's amazing. And she's got some great videos to watch online as well, where they've interviewed her. And it's not just birds, by the way. I even found out echidnas can be 60 years old. There's an echidna in a zoo in America that lived for 60 years, and they have tagged wild echidnas for 50 years. So yeah, the animals here are quite remarkable. We have a really high level of endemism as well. I mean, most of the plants and animals in Australia are only occurring in Australia. Most people don't even know budgies come from Australia. Eucalypts are uniquely Australian. 93% of the reptiles. 45% of the birds are considered endemic, but we do get birds that travel a lot. You know, they go to other countries. But even with that, 900 of the 10,000 odd birds identified in the world come from Australia. That's quite significant. And we also are much more dependent on hollows. We don't have woodpeckers, for example, to create hollows in trees and so on. That makes Australia quite unique and quite more vulnerable as well. Australasia has the highest proportion of threatened cavity nesting birds in the world. And that's probably one of the reasons, because we don't have animals that create hollows in trees. These pictures here are the same tree. There's 2 photos of the same tree taken at different times with birds time sharing. So it all goes back to the evolution of Australia. I often hear people say things like, it doesn't really matter as long as you put something green in, or they go to Bunnings, I hear them carry out environmentally friendly plants out for checkout because they are water-wise, but they're not native. I see councils putting in deciduous trees everywhere and saying they're green and environmentally friendly, but they're not evolved in Australia. So why is it so important to have something that's evolved in Australia? This is the really important piece of information that we as Australians need to know. It was a long time ago that Australia separated out from Gondwana. And Australia it's an island. It's been an island for a long time. It's a big island, but it's an island. And not only that, but when all the changes were happening to the climates over the last 120 million years or so, Australia was in the position where the ice wasn't as thick as it was in the Northern Hemisphere. It had warmer ocean currents going around it, which stopped that a little bit. And that may be why all the songbirds of the world have evolved from Australia. I'm only just throwing a hypothesis out there. I don't really know, but Australia is definitely unique. And it's interesting that only recently, the fact that songbirds of the world originated in Australia has been accepted. The subject was brought up a long time ago, but people kept thinking, oh no, Australia, it couldn't be Australia. Australia is quite special. They have even found 45 million year old Banksia cone fossils that show adaptation for fire. That means the seeds of those Banksias could not be released from their follicles unless there was a fire. So fire has been around a long time much longer than humans have been around. Humans haven't been around even 1 million years. So the plants and animals are adapted to fire. I took this photo off the internet, obviously, I didn't photograph it myself. And they even commented on the page, it looks like some prehistoric cockatoos have had a go at the seeds. We don't know what did that, but you can see that there's damage done to those follicles. So that's quite interesting. They've even found pollen that and leaf patterns that match pretty much perfectly today's Tasmanian waratah. And that waratah is a red flower, and red is known to attract birds. It's usually a bird-pollinated flower if it's red, not an insect-pollinated one. So 70 million years ago, it looks like the birds were already starting to evolve with the plants in Australia. So that's really key. Our native flora have evolved to need birds to pollinate them, and the birds need the flora. You can see on the beak of this eastern spinebill, there's some pollen around its face. So our plants are not like the Northern Hemisphere. They don't have mobile seed. They have mobile pollen. We have the famous migrations of the honey eaters. I was so excited when I learned about the thousands of birds that come through, past Mount Sugarloaf in April. I was blown away when I learned about that only a couple of years ago. That is key. They're carrying pollen with them like little silver eyes all the way, possibly from even Tasmania. Now, this has been going on for eons, and that means they're carrying genetic material from a similar species down there that helps the flora up here adapt to climate change. So they don't have mobile seeds, they have mobile pollen. That makes Australia really unique. But as more habitats are destroyed, that means preserving and planting trees for wildlife on private land is more and more critical. So your garden, it may only be used for half an hour while those migrating honey eaters are coming through, but that's a critical stepping stone habitat while they're coming through. It could be for nomadic birds, residential birds, or the migrating birds. So my mission in life is to try to get people to plant native gardens, obviously, in case you didn't work that hard. I mean, there's a lot of advantages to gardening and putting more trees around, obviously. Temperatures change, it keeps us nice and cool, which is more and more critical these days. Has anyone seen this picture going around the internet? And it's remarkable the differences. You see in the bottom picture, 66 degrees on the road, whereas when it's shaded by the trees, even though the ambient air temperature is quite similar, it's only 33 degrees. That makes a huge difference to livability for humans and also the cost of air conditioners. I mean, trees are just a big giant air conditioner that's biodegradable and bird habitat if they're native. So then it gets back to the native versus exotic argument, which I see a lot of people arguing about, especially in councils and where they're doing street planting or architects putting deciduous trees next to new houses because, they're deciduous. Oh, God. But yes, that's a little pet hate of mine, is there's deciduous trees everywhere, deciduous ornamental pears and so on. But I did find a paper done in Canberra, a study that looked at this argument, native versus exotic, and they did study a few gardens in that area, in that Canberra study area, where they looked at two types of gardens, all native or the traditional garden, which was considered to be mostly exotic with a few natives in it, because most people do have a few natives here and there without realising it, like a bottle brush or something, or a big flowered grevillea or something like that. So that's a pretty rough study looking at that. And it was the only equivalent I could find compared to what they've done over in America. And it's a difficult chart to read in this paper I looked at, but you can get the general idea when you're looking at, say, the abundance of species in the native compared to the non-native. and practically every other metric that they've used on that side, looking at the Simpson's diversity index, the biomass, the richness, species richness, abundance, all those are higher than the other side. So it does look like the native versus the exotic is better for birds. They also mentioned in that paper that most of the native trees that they were looking at were eucalypts. And of course, eucalypts are remarkable for bird food, habitat, and so on. And they have so much to offer. They have the ground level, they have the woody debris underneath, they have the mulch, the nectar, and the plant exudates. There's a whole lot of stuff that the gum trees do offer. But there are a lot of other native plants that offer a lot as well. So going back to Doug Tallamy's interests over in America, he argues that the native insects cannot or will not eat alien plants. And when the native plants disappear, the insects disappear. And that impoverishes the food source for birds and other animals. Now, I know that the argument is that birds in Australia are often nectivorous. They like the nectar and they have evolved with a lot of nectar-rich plants. So I tried to do a lot of research to find out just how many insects species would eat, even if they were so-called nectivorous birds, such as eastern spinebill, for example. And I did find that they still ate a lot of insects, especially when they were nesting. Now, the studies that Doug Tallamy was doing was also looking at particularly nesting birds. That was the main thing. It was when they're not nesting, it's not so important, but when they're nesting, it was very, very important. And the study that Doug Tallamy did looked at native versus exotics, and they found that it produced 75% less caterpillars, 60% less likely to have breeding chickadees. They were looking at chickadees over there. The nest contained 1.5 fewer eggs. Clutches were 29% less likely to survive. Nests produced 1.2 fewer fledglings, and maturation was delayed. So it did make a big difference to the chickadees. They also got some volunteers together to set up stations watching just how many trips they were making back to feed their babies, because over there, chickadees are often, they put up nest boxes for chickadees. They're quite a popular bird over there. So it was fairly easy to watch what they were bringing back. And they counted 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just to feed one clutch of chicks. I don't know what the equivalent is here in Australia with feeding birds that they need to be fed with caterpillars, but it's got to be a lot. And Doug Tallamy also did studies on other species, not just the chickadees. So this chart in his book looks at the different amounts in each graph are dragonflies, grasshoppers, cockroaches, praying mantis, caterpillars, flies, spiders. The green one is the caterpillars. And in almost every situation, looking at woodpeckers, crows, swallows, a whole lot of different types of birds, except hummingbirds, of course, that would have been expected. Yeah, they needed a lot of caterpillars when they were nesting. And I apologise, I've stolen Gordon Arthur's beautiful photo of this shining bronze cuckoo because it was holding a caterpillar that I could almost identify. I wasn't game enough to put up the name, but I think I know what it is. I think it's a caterpillar that lives on eucalypts. It specialises in eucalypts. So I looked at why do birds need caterpillars? Well, it turns out caterpillars are perfect baby food. They're soft and squishy to shove down the mouths of those little baby birds without getting anything too prickly and sharp with big legs and that, or hard shells to poke their throats. But they're also very high in protein, fats and lipids and carotenoids. And carotenoids, it turns out, is an important nutrition that birds need when they're breeding. It brings out the rich colours, you know, like carrots have got colour in them. The colours of their coats make them more sexy to their partners, and it also makes them healthier, and it also is really good baby bird food. And some studies looked at if you were to feed birds individual nutrition like that with just carotenoids but without the fats and lipids, they don't absorb it as well. So it needs to be a combined package. I also looked at another chart that looked at different caterpillars. RNA is spiders, coleopters, beetles, formidae, that's ants. But the Lepidoptera, the two tall charts in the middle, they're the butterflies and moths. They were, every chart I looked at was very high in carotenoids if it was butterflies and moths. And Doug Tallamy put this graph in one of his slideshows, which demonstrates it pretty well. So lots of birds like to eat worms and beetles and spiders and things, but it's the caterpillars that are the high ones in carotenoids. But the game changer here is that because caterpillars are so fussy about what they can eat, because plants and caterpillars have evolved together overseas and in Australia, they're always fighting each other. You know, the plants don't want to be eaten, the insects want to eat the plants. So they're very highly specialised. Most insects that eat plants, herbivorous insects, can only develop and reproduce on the plants in which they share an evolutionary history. And that's where the evolutionary history of Australia comes in. We have such a long evolutionary history that it doesn't make sense to put exotic plants in. They will not feed the caterpillars. And then I found this wonderful book, this chart inside the book of Doug Tallamy's called Bringing Nature Home. And it lists all the herbivorous insects that they studied on some invasive plants over there, including Melaleuca quinquenervia. And I went, Melaleuca quinquenervia, I know that one. And it says in its homeland, 409 herbivorous insects are hosted on it. I thought, crikey, I've never read that before, and I love plants. And I couldn't find that information. And when I finally found the scientific paper that backed up that data, it was an overseas study. We haven't even done the studies here. And the only reason they did it overseas was because it is such a really serious invasive plant over there. And they were desperate to find out what can control the bastard. Because only 8 species can feed on Melaleuca quinquenervia over in Florida, and it's been there 120 years. So yeah, it really makes a difference. This, I think, is a game changer. This is the general rule. When you've got a native plant, it will host the native insects. Exotic plants don't. You can put buddleia and other things into your garden and it will bring in butterflies to feed on the nectar, but it will not host them. It cannot breed them. That's the key. And that's what Doug says. He says he bought this block of land that was overrun with weeds, and he said he's an entomologist and he was looking for insects, and he said they're all missing. There's nothing here. So that's why he did those studies. And it is amazing what kind of insects we have, like the cup moths. I photographed that one up at Wabicool. And the beautiful emerald lace moths. So many species. I mean, 409 herbivorous insects. Just the herbivorous insects can breed on Melaleuca quinquenervia in its homeland. I found this beautiful moth on my back veranda one year, and I was blown away. We have some amazing fauna here. So let's talk about birdscaping your garden. I mean, we had Daryl Jones a little while ago talking about, you know, should you feed the birds, should you not feed the birds? And there's a lot of arguments about that, but they all agree on 2 things: add water add native plants. You can't go wrong. And birds are so important. They give us a sense of place. I had a sound file of a kookaburra here, but I just thought it was a little bit odd to put in, so I took it out. But it's funny, you know, overseas, I have overseas visitors come to my place a lot because I have a B&B. And when they hear a kookaburra, they go, oh, what's that? Is that the kookaburra that we've heard about? I'll go, yeah. We take it for granted. The birds here are amazing. And I think it's very, I did put it in. I thought I moved. I went to a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and there was an Indigenous guy there who could mimic a kookaburra call and all the different kinds of kookaburra calls, including alarm, so well. It was incredible. But that's what I think we need to do, is have those native plants around that bring in the native birds, so we develop a sense of place, and that then fosters support for local environmental issues. It just happens that way naturally if you have the native plants around you. So that's why I think it is so important. This book by George Adams on birdscaping, which is lovely, I just thought I'd throw this photo in because I've got this plant in my garden, and it's a stunning garden plant that only grows about 3 meters high, called Melicope rubra. And in fact, it's a rainforest plant that says in the books to put in shade. I've actually got it in my rainforest at the back of my place, but I'm now trialing it as a street tree, and it's perfect. It's in full sun. It's not too big. It's a beautiful umbrella-shaped little tree with flowers on the trunks and branches going down like that. There's so many beautiful and unique native plants that we can use in our gardens. This is where I come in to help, or you go to a nursery that specialises in native plants, or there are a lot of places online where you can get information. But we need to learn about these things, because we don't have to stick to the old big hybrid grevilleas and the West Australian grafted expensive flowering gums that bring in the bigger, more aggressive birds. We can have beautiful gardens without that. We can have the local plants and still have a beautiful garden. So Don't Tell Me Again in America talks about the oak tree over there. It has a remarkable life history with an insect that lives in the acorns, and it needs to have mulch underneath the trees to complete the life cycle of these acorns. And it takes a couple of years, and then various species use the acorn one after the other, and it's quite an interesting story. But I thought, well, what equivalent have we got here? And it turns out the cheese tree has an equivalent story. Does anyone know the cheese tree? Great. So it's a common tree around here that grows dead easy and lives for a long time. I find it tends to drop nearly all its leaves at the end of winter and then comes out in a nice flush of new growth. And it seems to be a fantastic habitat tree. It's listed as a really good nesting tree, and a lot of birds eat the fruit. But interestingly, oh, and even the rainbow lorikeets eat the new leafy growth. But interestingly, it has these obligate insects that pollinate the flowers and then live inside the fruit, never leaving it. And they're a moth. So that's quite remarkable that a moth will come inside the flower and then turn into a larva inside there. And you can see there's a little moth, a fully fledged moth inside one of the locules in the fruit. So I've heard that I read that the pied currawongs are also known to eat the fruit, but then regurgitate them. And I just wondered, maybe they're more interested in the larva that's inside the fruit and they don't really want the rest of it. I don't know, but all these studies need to be done, you know, there's just so much information out there. And the cheese tree is a very beautiful tree. So there's lots of other plants that we can put in our gardens that aren't too big if we've only got a small area. For example, the acacias. There's a lot of acacias that host some wonderful butterflies, and they can be host specific as well. Like one acacia will be a host for one butterfly, for example. I photographed this acacia on the top right-hand side there. which is Acacia maydenii, and had a little lady beetle on it. And I just find it fascinating that whenever you're looking at acacias, you generally do find insects on them. They just love acacias for some reason. It might be because of the exudates and the sweetness, I don't know, but they definitely are a fantastic little plant for insects. And there's a lot of acacias that don't get too big. And I've actually planted them in this garden here at Hunter Valley Private Hospital just up the road. This was quite a few years ago. I haven't seen the garden for a while. But we set up a garden there with Coria alba, some a short-growing casuarina called Alocasuarina distyla, some Wistringia, and some Acacia terminalis, the sunshine wattle. And it made a lovely garden bed. It's sort of reminiscent of heathland. And there's lots of foliages that can work really well in gardens as well, like the forest oak, Alocasuarina torullosa. That is the rare and endangered glossy black cockatoos have to have this one for the seeds. That's their food. Bacchausia myrtifolia is also called nutmeg myrtle. It can be kept as a little hedge, and you can use it in cooking, and it's got a nutmeg flavour like the lemon myrtle. There's a dwarf ginger that's a local ginger. People often know the big tall ginger that you can grow, especially the one with the red back. But there's a little one that's quite a darling little ginger plant that has blue fruits that birds can eat as well. And of course, the Banksias. The Banksias have the most beautiful foliage, often with rich red new growth. You can see spider webs all over this, which would indicate that there's lots of little insects all over it as well. And of course, the most magnificent flowers. I went to a cut flower farm once where they were selling one Banksia flower for $10 wholesale. And most of these cut flowers were being sold overseas to Japan and other places. And yeah, we should be growing our own cut flowers in our home gardens. By the way, cut flower industry can be very toxic. So yes, definitely grow your own cut flowers, but that's another talk. Banksia spinulosa has the most beautiful foliage, and you get different forms of it. Sometimes they might find Banksia spinulosa that's really low, growing near the headlands, which makes good, you can make good use of that in your garden if you want something small. And some of them are a lot taller. The Banksia roba can have a most delicious malty kind of a perfume. Has anyone ever smelt the perfume on Banksia roba? And that might be where the birds called into with the perfume of the Banksia roba. I was surprised when I smelled that. And Banksia ericofolia, some horticulturists have gone around selecting really nice colour forms or bushy forms and given them names like Little Eric or Ice Bobo or something. And they sell them in nurseries now, so you can get lots of different select forms. They're not hybrids, they're just forms of plant that they found growing naturally in the wild. They are a wild plant, but they might work really well for you in your garden. And I didn't take that picture of the beautiful Rufus fantail, but I just wanted to highlight the fact that the Berseria spinosa is a wonderful habitat plant. The Berseria is always mentioned whenever someone's talking about a habitat garden, if someone's giving a talk on habitat gardening. And that's been my experience too. They seem to be really good at hosting insects, and that's why they're great for birds. Plus, they're a little bit prickly and they're not too big. They get to about 2 or 3 meters high. They're also called bush Christmas in Tasmania because they tend to flower around Christmas time. But around here, they're just usually called sweet Berseria. But it's a lovely thing. The foliage of it used to be harvested for esculent, which was made into a sunscreen during World War II days. It's a very interesting plant. Bottle brushes, everyone knows the bottle brushes, and they're tough as. You can get them from prostrate forms to shrub forms to tall forms and lots of different colours. They host all sorts of insects. Native bees love them. That top right-hand corner I photographed a beautiful katydid on a green flowered form of Callistemon pinifolius I've got growing at my place. Grevilleas. If you get the smaller flower types of grevilleas, it's a much better idea to help the birds without attracting the bigger, more aggressive birds. Then there's a lot of different ones of those you can get. The one on that right-hand side is Grevillea sericea. I love that one because it tends to flower all year and it only grows about 1 metre. And of course, mistletoe. You can't go by mistletoe. There's lots of studies that have shown that mistletoe makes a huge difference to the wildlife around. And all you need to do is find a mistletoe fruit and squash it onto a branch of your tree. And sometimes it takes. But there's lots of different kinds. So you can look up all the different kinds of mistletoe you can get. You can have grassy types of plants and do wonderful things with grassy plants in your garden. Grassy plants are good for a lot of different things. They host a lot of different moths. Lamandras, poas, even dianellas all host different kinds of moths and butterflies. And then, of course, they can be beautiful in your garden. And the one in the middle with the violets, that was an old laundry tub that I used in a garden as a screen with Leporomia sedge planted in it. It was non-draining, and then violets as a ground cover, just as something different. So, and then down the left-hand side at Boongala Native Gardens in Sydney, they've put a whole lot of grasses in tall pots, tall terracotta pots, just for a sculptural interest. And the top left-hand corner is Libertia paniculata, which is a local little, like a little lily, really. It only goes about this high and flowers with beautiful white flowers in spring. It's also called butterfly flag. This is one of my gardens at Bar Beach, close to the salt winds, and it's planted out with heath-like plants. The gold-coloured plant in the middle is Homoranthus prolixus. There's a guy in Sydney who's doing a talk for the Australian Plant Society next month, actually, who promotes that, and he calls it Goldie Tops. It's a wonderful plant that looks almost like a Japanese bonsai, but it grows wild around the Pilliga, very, very hardy in dry sort of country. Now, one thing I will warn you, if you're going to put in a native garden, especially one that's low and bushy to the ground like this, please make sure there's no cats in it. There is now cats in that garden. There's no birds anymore. And I'm really cranky about that. But this one's up at the top of the hill at Redhead in Ocean Street. And they've converted all their front nature strip. Oops, didn't get council permission for that one. And now they don't have to mow the lawn, and it's full of lizards and insects, and the birds can use that as a stepping stone while they're moving across that narrow bit of vegetation across the top of Redhead Bluff. This is more examples of like a heathland kind of gardens with dwarf banksias. You can put fennel flowers in it. The other three photographs are of a garden I photographed in Canberra, where it was extremely dry. This is in drought time as well, where they've used grasses, Coria alba, yellow buttons, and lots of other heathy type plants, which work really well. And they're tough, they block out all the weeds. So once you've got these going, you've really got a no maintenance garden. This is another one of those Goldie Tops in the middle there, just about to come into flower. And it's a front garden with a combination of different plants to look aesthetically pleasing, but at the same time feeding the birds. Blueberry ash I planted on my nature strip actually because I'm close to Glenrock, and I was hoping it might bring in Regent bowerbird. Now that's a terrible photo I took of the Regent bowerbird I finally got, but I'm putting it in because I was so proud of that. It took a long time, but I did finally get Regent bowerbird coming in to feed on the blueberries on my blueberry ash tree planted at the front of my house, when the back of my house backs onto Glenrock Reserve. And you can get pink flowered forms and white flowered forms of it. The two trees I planted at Hunter Valley Private Hospital years ago, actually, they're the prima donna form, which is a more compact, bushy, pink flowered form, which is handy if you want a hedge that's narrow. But it's fantastic for insects as well. So now I've got a few befores and afters. This was a garden that was pretty bushy and close to Merewether the Glenrock area there, and they wanted to attract birds and so forth. But it wasn't really a usable space because this window up here was next door looking onto the space, and the backdrop brick wall was their garage. So we cleared it out a little bit around there and then planted some native plants to screen on the window, and that's what it went to. So just go back, see the red leaves on the left hand. That's the same thing there once we cleared out a little bit and let the sun in for that red leaf. It's a Waterhousea unipunctata. And then you've got the nice sitting area. You can't see the house anymore. I planted ivory curl tree. That was just something that was nice and thick and bushy to screen it off, and it's worked really well. And I put in a dragonfly pot. I love doing dragonfly pots because they're like an alternative to a bird bath. So you don't have to clean it out all the time. The idea is very, very simple. Just get a big water pot that doesn't leak. Put a couple of bricks in the bottom, preferably that have holes through them, like extruded bricks or Besser blocks. And then put a nice rock in the middle that half emerges up out of the pond. So it's a beautiful island for birds to land on. And then 1 or 2 pot plants of aquatic native plants. The native plants with the soil in their pots will filter the water and oxygenate it. And that brings in dragonflies and frogs. And the dragonflies will breed in there, and you won't get any mosquitoes. If you're really worried about mosquitoes, you put in bladderwort, which is a native local insectivorous plant, and makes a fine network under the water. And I have got 7 ponds in my garden and no mosquitoes. And that breeds up the dragonflies to control the mosquitoes as the adults as well as underwater. And it works really well. So this is a before at Toronto, looking onto the water. It was all lawn. We just covered the lawn with newspaper to stop photosynthesis and block out the sun and kill the grass, and then planted native plants. And that's what it looks like now. And they're very happy with that because they wanted flowers and they wanted habitat for wildlife. This is a nature strip at Valentine, in a very quiet little dead-end street. I'm really disappointed because I asked my little 6-year-old granddaughter today when I showed her this presentation, I said, now, spot the difference. No car, she said. I failed. Yep, she's right. So yeah, that's what you can do. And that's the other side of the house. I've put a dragonfly pot in there. It's quite safe because it actually has pot plants of plants in the water, so nothing can fall in and drown. But underneath those pot plants is bricks and rocks and rubble, and that's little nooks and crannies where tadpoles can hide. So I hope I've inspired you all to get started and plant a native garden. Thank you.